In my first two videos on the topic of the lost city of Atlantis, I connected the dots on more than a dozen similarities between Plato's description of Atlantis to that of the Rekhat structure, which is commonly referred to as the Eye of the Sahara and is located in a remote region of northwest Africa in the country of Mauritania. And my argument in those videos was that these similarities are so numerous and so precise that the Rekhat structure should be considered as the most likely location for this lost ancient civilization. However, nothing is certain, and it is undoubtedly the subject of much debate. But if after watching those first two videos you still doubted the possibility that the Rekhat structure could be the location of Atlantis, well, in this video, I'm going to share with you some new details that I just came across that makes the case that the Eye of Africa is not just the most likely location of Atlantis, but the connection of these added details I'm about to share makes this case so compelling that it's practically definitive. So let me jump right into these details, and afterwards I'll connect the dots on everything so we can see exactly what we're dealing with here. Like I stated in my first video, the legend of Atlantis originates from the ancient Egyptians, and the Greek lawmaker Solon recorded this information while visiting Egypt some 2,600 years ago, and the information was passed down through 6 generations to Plato, who published the account of Atlantis in the Timaeus and Critias dialogues some 2,400 years ago, and is apparently the only reason why we know about the legend of Atlantis today. Plato stated that the king of the capital of Atlantis was named Atlas, who was the firstborn son of Poseidon, and of course, like I mentioned before, Poseidon had 10 children through 5 sets of twins, and each one of those 10 children went on to rule each of those 10 kingdoms that made up the empire of Atlantis. Now, remember the name Atlas and hold that thought for a moment as I share something else that will connect the dots on this new information. There is a group of people that used to be referred to as the Maori. However, in modern times, they are now known as the Berber people, which inhabit a region of northwest Africa. A region once referred to as Mori, but now known as Maghreb, which essentially makes up modern-day Numidia, Morocco, West Algeria, and Mauritania. In fact, the name Mauritania comes from the Maori people. Now, does anyone happen to know the name of who was said to be the first king of Mauritania? Well, it was someone who just so happened to be named Atlas, the legendary king of the Maori people. What a coincidence. But of course, there can be no possible connection to Atlas, the king of Atlantis, because after all, there is simply no way that Atlantis could ever have been in the remote region of northwest Africa. Now hold that thought for a moment too, as I share something else with you that you've likely never seen or heard of before. There was an ancient Greek man named Herodotus who lived some 2,500 years ago, who you may be familiar with as being known as the father of history, made famous for his documentation of the Greco-Persian Wars. Herodotus was born nearly 75 years after Solon had died, and again, Solon was the person who documented the story of Atlantis from the ancient Egyptians. Herodotus himself also died when Plato was just 2 years old, so he never knew either of them, and subsequently died many years before Plato had ever published the account of Atlantis. One of Herodotus' notable achievements was developing what was then the most accurate mapping of the known inhabited world at the time of 450 BC. First, let's orient ourselves here. We can clearly see Italy, the Mediterranean Sea, the countries that surround it, the Caspian Sea, the Red Sea, the Nile Delta, to name a few notable features. And let me transition to a different version of the map so we can see things more clearly, but if you look to the left, what do you see there? That's right, the word Atlantis, which is shown to be located south of the Pillars of Hercules, or the Strait of Gibraltar, and positioned in northwest Africa. Let me first say that I do not know how or why Herodotus came to this conclusion, as this is something that I need to research more, but I look forward to any insight that people will be sharing in the comments related to his development of this map and why he claimed that Atlantis was in that specific location. You'll also notice on this map the detailing of a mountain chain just south of the Strait of Gibraltar, known today as the Atlas Mountains, which are also known to be home of the Berber people, which I mentioned earlier. And these mountains were in fact named after Atlas, the first king of Mauritania. You know, something else that's interesting to point out, when you research Atlas, the king of Mauritania, there seems to be no connection to Atlantis. I assume that this is related to the fact that nobody has ever considered that the location of Atlantis could be hiding in plain sight in the Western Sahara Desert in what is now Mauritania. Let me take a quick moment to thank John for leaving this outstanding comment, which brought the information of the First King of Mauritania as well as Herodotus' map to my attention, something that I was otherwise unaware of, and I suspect that goes to most everyone else watching this video. So let me clarify where we're at right now. There is a 2,500-year-old map that annotates the location of Atlantis in Northwest Africa, seemingly in the exact location of the Riqat structure. And this map was created by the so-called Father of History, a trusted source of documentation praised by modern-day historians for his ability to systematically document information in vivid detail. Then we have this mysterious and incredibly unique structure in Mauritania known as the Riqat. This structure just so happens to be made of concentric circles, just as Plato had stated. But not only that, it consists of the precise amount of rings, 3 that would be of water and 2 of land. And on top of that, it just so happens to be the precise size of how Atlantis was described, measuring 23.5 kilometers or 14.5 miles across when computed in modern-day measurements. It also has an opening to the south that would match Atlantis' description of connecting to the sea, and in fact, its very appearance today seems to suggest that it did. It has mountains to the north, and not only that, the mountains to the north contained rivers. The entire area surrounding the Riqat is a large level plain. The sides of Atlantis were said to be steep towards the side of the sea, and the Adra Highlands located in this area have a steep 1,500-foot drop from cliffside to its base. Even more significantly, the center island of the Riqat produces fresh spring water, just as Plato specified, and this is despite the wells in the surrounding area producing exclusively salt water, which also is further evidence that this site was once under the ocean. The area around the Riqat has an abundance of black, red, and white color stone. And Atlantis was said to have an abundance of elephants, which elephants exist in Mauritania today, and depictions of elephants can be seen in cave art close to the Riqat structure. There are even relics including pottery shards, arrowheads, and other evidence that a civilization once lived there, yet archaeologists have no idea what civilization they belong to or when. And all of this is in Mauritania, where people who were once known as the Maury people were led by a legendary king whose name was Atlas, the same exact name as the king of Atlantis. But on top of all of this, it just so happens to be in the exact location that is annotated on an ancient map that was created by who we refer to as the Father of History. I mean, this is an X marks the spot if there ever was one, especially when you consider the nature of the many precise similarities between the Riqat structure and Plato's description of Atlantis. Now for me, this is more than compelling. This is Atlantis, despite the fact that yes, this site today is nearly 1,300 feet above sea level. Because the scientific explanation for the Riqat's creation would make sense for it to be Atlantis when you simply compare it to what Plato had stated about Atlantis' destruction, describing how an earthquake caused Atlantis to sink into the depths of the ocean. Perhaps that earthquake was the Riqat itself. For example, scientists believe it went through multiple processes of being lifted up and down as its subsurface dome collapsed and later lifted again, a process that was repeated multiple times and creating the concentric circles that we see today. I mean, geologists literally describe it as a dome, so the subsurface dome collapsed, Atlantis sank, also explaining the earthquake. I mean, this seems fitting, especially when we acknowledge all of the matching precise similarities to what Plato had said, such as the concentric circles, specifically 3 of water and 2 of land, its precise size, and everything else. It certainly seems definitive to me as this far exceeds coincidence. And you know, that reminds me, I received a comment from someone claiming to live in Mauritania and going on to mention that locals have seen various fish skeletons in the Riqat following rainstorms. If this is true, I might be willing to pay as much as $1,000 for evidence of that. If it can be video recorded in such a way that any viewer would see and know that the evidence was not planted, and if the video included detailed panorama shots of the Riqat, plus video of the GPS location, etc. If this is true, well, I can't help but think that the significant difference in value between US dollars and the currency of Mauritania, well, perhaps even just a few hundred US dollars would make it more than worth it to go out there and take pictures of any evidence that can be found. seashells, whatever, but I'll get back to that in just a moment. First, let me also mention that there is evidence that this region was under the ocean far more recently than the tens of millions of years that some people claim, as non-fossilized whale bones have been found in the desert of Mauritania. And this example you're seeing here should not be confused with a different discovery in the Egyptian desert of actual fossils of whale bones. And you can clearly see the difference for yourself, as fossils are essentially bones that over millions of years became stone. So, if scientists claim that it takes more than 1 million years for bones to become fossils, why are there non-fossilized whale bones in the desert of Mauritania? But getting back to my potential offer to pay to see evidence of sea life at the Richat, I received a number of outstanding comments of people that searched the Richat structure through Google Earth and provided the coordinates to some very interesting satellite images of potential structures on the ground. What are these? Were these made in modern times? Here you can see various satellite photos of these structures, followed by a zoomed out view so you can see where they were taken in relation to the Richat. But look at this one located in the center island of the Richat. It almost looks like the outline of a castle or something. Perhaps there is a simple explanation for it, but I might be willing to pay several hundred US just to see a photo of what this looks like from the ground. It cannot be overstated just how remote this site is and how little it is visited. This is not a tourist attraction. This thing is in the middle of nowhere, and this is just another example of why the Richat needs to be studied from the ground and excavated. And getting back to Herodotus's map, I mean, were you even aware of a 2,500-year-old map showing the location of Atlantis in Northwest Africa? I mean, I'm sure some people have heard of it, but I went ahead and did a word scan through my YouTube creator dashboard of all the comments I've received in my 2 prior videos on Atlantis. And it appears that only 4 people mentioned this map. Just 4 out of nearly 25,000 comments between my 2 previous videos on Atlantis. In other words, it's fair to say that pretty much nobody has heard of this. And it's also worth pointing out that this map shows the Nile River going from east to west, as various legends have long stated. And you know, this reminds me of a detail I pointed out in my previous video involving the recent land survey of Mauritania that identified a massive river that once ran through it. It seems to me that this river may have been the Nile, a possibility that hopefully scientists will research more in the future. But of course, many people rule out the possibility of the Eye of the Sahara being a possible location of Atlantis due to its current elevation above sea level, and I understand where people are coming from, but it really is time that we start asking new questions about what's geologically possible on this planet over a certain length of time in regards to land movement. It's right here in our faces, guys, and this discovery provides us with such a huge opportunity to not only learn about a lost civilization, but learn about the workings of planet Earth as well. We cannot assume that we know all there is to know. Now, let me take a moment to address a couple points of discussion that came up following my previous Atlantis videos. For instance, I used the example of floodmap.net to paint a picture for the viewer of how the Richat structure could be a feasible location and design for Atlantis if the area was at sea level some 12,000 years ago. Many people commented stating that if this were the case, Egypt would have to be under the ocean as well, but I'm suggesting that a region of the Western Sahara was lifted. I am not suggesting that the ocean was some 1,500 feet higher. And since there is no landrise.net, the floodmap.net comparison was just what I said it was in that video, to paint you a picture of what the Richat and surrounding area would look like if it ever was at sea level. Another point I want to bring up is in regards to my Antarctica comparison in relation to the speed at which land can rise over a period of time. Some have pointed out that the article I used stated that Antarctica is rising because the land is being lifted back up as the ice melts, causing something like a sponge effect, and those are my own words by the way, of the rising of the land with the reduced weight of the lost ice. But there is more to this, and the article specifically mentions it being pushed up by the flowing mantle beneath. Like I said in my prior video, I used this comparison to simply point out that it is possible for land to rise at a certain speed over a certain period of time. However, the Richat is a volcanic anomaly, and that's what volcanic activity does. It raises the ground. I think that most people understood what I was saying, but the skeptics jumped on this, and I would just like to encourage people to think for themselves, because that same article mentioned not one single word about volcanoes underneath Antarctica. Yet we know that there are at least 91 volcanoes underneath its ice, although scientists have not confirmed if those volcanoes are active or not. But Surely some of them are, considering that there are at least 400 subglacial lakes underneath that ice. Obviously, something is melting it to create those lakes that are underneath as much as 2 miles of ice. And it seems to me that the Antarctica land rise is related to that volcanic activity. Not because there's less ice and land is rising like a sponge or something, but that point is irrelevant because going back to the Recot, they haven't even drilled it. This illustration you see here is just that, an educated guess as to what's happened underneath. And apparently many scientists who have speculated about the Recot have never actually visited the site in person, so keep that in mind. So to close this video trilogy on the topic of Atlantis and the Recot structure, let me just say that I have not discovered anything. I only discovered a little-known documentary on the topic of Atlantis, and I am simply sharing that information with as many people as I possibly can. And that is the purpose of this channel. I have no desire to have something published in some scientific journal. That's for other nerds. I'm a different type of nerd. And nerd is a term of endearment, by the way, for me. My desire is to share information that I find interesting or important with the masses, and I will be discussing many different topics on this channel. And in the future, I will even be remaking certain videos I have now that already have millions of views, as I'm trying to build the quality of this channel, and some of those videos, just the presentation, various inaccuracies in the information, the editing, there's just a lot of room for improvement, so look forward to that. And keep in mind, I do 100% of this myself, and I'm learning as I go as far as my editing skills as well as just my delivery in front of the camera. And that reminds me, I will also be making a video in the future to talk more about me and who I am and what brought me on this journey to making YouTube videos. So look forward to that. But like I've said before, this is just the beginning of this channel. There is so much to be shared with the masses that far exceeds the topic of ancient civilization. That's just one thing. Humanity is starting to wake up to various truths, and I am going to accelerate that awakening. And I'm going to make some real noise while doing it, mark my words. But I'll leave it at that. I'm Jimmy, this is Bright Insight. Like and subscribe and leave me a comment and let me know what your thoughts are on all of this involving Atlantis and the Recot structure. But to me, this is just so compelling that this requires excavation at this point. So I'll just leave it at that. I have a new video coming out around this time next week, so look forward to that. But take care, everybody.